Alright, so I'm ready to make a couple bowls here. I've got 3 chunks of clay paddled out and ready to go. Usually for a bowl I'll use about 2 pounds. Thanks! The joys of hybrid teaching! See you later! I just got made fun of by somebody at school for talking to myself. Anyway, I usually start out with about 2 pounds of clay, so it's a little bit more clay than you would typically use for the cylinders that we've done. If you're feeling confident with 2 pounds, which should give you like a small cereal bowl when you're done, you could go up to 2.5 pounds, and this would give you a nice big finished bowl once it's glazed. But again, if you're not comfortable with the 2 pounds, don't move up in size. So I'm going to go pretty quick here. The steps are pretty much the same. The only difference that I do with a little bit more clay like this is I do what's called coning, where I cone the clay up into this shape first, and then I push it back down and center it as I push it back down. And if you've got a piece that's really wobbling, this is a good way to get that wobble to go away, and you work that up toward the top. It's kind of like doing a pole, but you're not pulling the walls, you're just pulling the cone itself. When you do that, my left hand, for me, could be your right, but for me it's my left. I'm still pushing in with this hand, and instead of pushing down with my other hand, I pull in against this hand. So I've heard it referred to as a push and a pull. And I'm doing both of those, and I'll switch my hands up here so you can see maybe how my fingers are working. I push in, and I'm moving that clay up to the top, and then push it back down. This would be a good thing to try once you start using a little bit more clay. Other than that, steps are pretty much the same. As I open this up, I'm trying to keep my hands really steady. I don't have to open the floor quite as low as I have in the past for the cylinders. I keep it a little bit thick because I'm going to go back and trim the bottoms of this. And so I need a little extra clay down at the bottom. And then when I open the floor up, I'm not opening it totally flat. I'm keeping that floor a little bit curved this way. Maybe subtle. It's not totally flat. It can be a little subtle. But I still do relatively a cylinder when I do my first couple pulls. I'm trying to get this bowl to be a shorter, wider cylinder than what we had been doing previously. Every time I do a demo on here, it seems like I have bubbles in my clay. Alright, so right now my walls are a little bit thicker than that 1/4 inch that we were usually shooting for. And I leave them intentionally slightly thick because I'm going to start stretching this out. When I stretch it out, the walls are actually going to thin out as well. And so if they're too thin to begin with, I'm not going to be able to stretch my bowl very far. Alright, so when I stretch, it looks kind of like a pull. I have my hand on the outside with some water and usually a sponge for a little bit of support. And my hand on the inside, I'm not pinching the clay, I'm just pushing the clay out and moving my hands up as I push out. So I throw my cylinder first and then I start to stretch. And I'm really focusing on the shape here. I'm not just stretching without really thinking about the shape. I want to have a nice fluid curve right through the center. I don't want there to be inconsistencies in the curve. And I always take my rib and rib the outside and just make sure I've got a nice uniform wall. And I go and rib the inside. Make sure I've cleaned that up as well. Now this is a pretty simple shape. It's also, there is some There is something nice about a simple form that just works. But I want you guys to challenge yourselves to come up with a little bit more unique forms. So there's three things you really need to be thinking about when you're making a bowl. You've got to think about the overall profile, the shape of the body. You need to think about the rim and what the rim shape looks like. And you also need to be thinking about the foot and what is the foot going to look like when I'm done. When I'm done, I go in and trim a bunch of this clay off so that I've got a nice angle change at the bottom, and that foot almost lifts the bowl up off the table a little bit. For my rim, I find that bowls that just kind of have a straight wall like this tend to warp a little bit more easily. And so there's a couple things you could do with a rim. One of my favorites is to just stretch and flare that rim out. So I've got my clay is a little bit wet. I've got my fingertip down here on the outside, and I'm going to push the top of this out over the top of my finger. Just widens the diameter of that bowl a little bit. And as I do that, this has thinned out a little bit now. So I don't want to stretch it too much more. I do not want this to be paper thin. If you get this part paper thin, you're going to need to go back and cut it with your needle and try to get back to a thicker point. And now here, I could take my rib and I could define this curve here a little bit more. So as I do this, you should be able to see over here. Watch that shape change a little bit. Always thinking about the inside of this being an eating surface. So I really want to make sure that the walls are smooth. On the outside, I'm not as concerned. I could do different textural things on the outside, but the inside, I definitely want to make sure is nice and smooth. And again, I've got these bubbles. Apparently I didn't wedge very well. Maybe I'm in a rush. Anytime you get a bubble, you can just get your needle tool and get it wet. Poke that bubble from the top and push the air out from the bottom. That's usually a good way to get rid of one. Sometimes you got to do it once or twice, or sometimes you do it once and it comes back later. Okay. Now, what's very, very important, probably one of the most important things with your bowl, is you want to make sure that your top is perfectly level and symmetrical. If you've got the top wobbling up and down like this, it's going to cause your bowl to be crooked when you turn this upside down and trim it. So if the top has any wobble at all, you need to make sure you cut that with your needle tool. Mine's pretty good, but I'm going to cut it anyway just to show. So you could do this from the bottom, cutting up, or sometimes I'll do it from the top and cut through. And I'm just supporting the outside of the rim. I'll push my needle, oops, I messed it up. Push my needle through the side of the piece until I cut all the way through. And then usually you can slow down your wheel and peel that right off of there. Okay, so do that if you need to. If yours is perfectly level, don't worry about it. But more often than not, beginners would probably need to make that fix. And then I always go back in and clean up the rim and make sure that it's nice and smooth and nice and round. This sponge, if you have something like this, a flatter sponge works really great because I can wrap this around the rim. Now, some things that you could do for designs. I like putting a little design in the rim sometime, and I'll use just the edge of this wooden knife, and I can push a couple times down into the rim and make a pattern. And what I'm thinking about when I do that is, how is that going to catch glaze, and how is that going to look once that glaze cools in there? And it's a really simple technique to do. Okay, Now, I have to flip this over and trim it at some point, which means I'm going to remove a lot of this clay. So I don't necessarily have to do an undercut, but I like to do one because this quick little 5-second step will probably save me a good amount of trimming time when I get to the actual trimming part. So if you're doing one bowl, it's probably not significant, but if you have 5 or 6 bowls to trim, you could save yourself a half an hour's worth of work time just by doing an undercut. Okay, now when you are done with this, just like always, you should wire this off. And you should make sure that once you do that, just leave it on your back. I never recommend trying to take your bowl up off the bat. You're just going to ruin the shape of it. So even if you're only down to one bat, we'll try to find you another one. Don't take your piece off here by hand. Let it dry till it's leather hard before you take it off. You're just going to ruin your piece if you try to get it off of there. So I've got a couple more. I'm just going to speed through them a little bit. These are a little bit larger amount of clay, and I'm going to try to come up with some different shapes that you might be interested in and you might try. Again, centering, coning up, push-pull with my hands, push in with one, pull in with the other, move that clay up to the top, and then push that clay down, keeping my left, in my case, my left hand, my side pressure. I'm keeping that hand nice and steady. Sometimes I'll even use my sponge and do a pull with my fingertips up the side of the piece, and that just helps to move some of that clay that's a little bit out of center up to the top. For this one, I'm leaving my floor a little bit thicker yet. I've got some extra clay here, so I could leave more clay in the floor so I can trim a taller foot overall. I'm going to pull the wall straight up. Now this piece I'm going for just a slightly different overall shape. I'm going to keep the vertical wall somewhat and start stretching it out at the bottom. Now pull my wall up a little bit more again. Now this wall is pretty thin, but my rim right here is, I've left it a little bit thick. And I'm going to change the shape of the rim here in just a minute, but before I do that, I'm going to do some ribbing, get rid of all the wet stuff. Never ever ever try to stretch your piece out too early. Always get the cylinder thrown first. Once you've got your cylinder, then you can start stretching it. And for this one, I'm going to do bubbles again. For this one, I'm going to do a little bit of a pattern with my rib and draw my rib up the outside. And I'm going to use this little corner of the rib to make a mark and sort of spiral that mark right up the side of the piece. And if I'm careful, I can keep the same speed all the way up. It should be pretty much concentric. Now I usually get a lot of little crumbs on there, so it's good to just go back and soften those out. And then I'm going to stretch this rim kind of like I stretched the last one. Open this back up a little bit. Again, save myself a little bit of trimming time by doing an undercut. sure to slice it off with your wire and leave it on your bat. And we're going to do one more. Now this next one, I'm going to take just a little extra clay. And come up with a slightly different idea and a little more complex shape than the first two. I think that sometimes when you're using a little bit more clay, it's helpful to do a pull with your sponge. I'm pinching from the inside with my fingertips, but I'm using my sponge on the outside. Then as I get the walls a little bit thinner, I can switch back over to my fingertips. But sometimes for those first few pulls, it really helps to use a sponge. Okay, so I'm getting my walls a little thinner here. I'm going to start stretching out the base of the bowl now, similar to what I did last time. A little pull up the side to straighten it out. Now for this one, I'm actually going to angle the top in a little bit and close my bowl off just some. So I'm bringing that top back around, and I'm going to straighten this out with my rib tool. Thin this out a little bit. Keep it kind of flat. I'm going to make a little indent just below this to separate the body from the rim. And again, I might put some design in the rim. Always thinking about how the glaze is going to interact with the designs. Do the same thing down here, push in just a little bit and separate the body of the bowl from the base and where the foot's going to end up going. And I can trim that, clean that up a little bit later. And then for this one, I'm going to do some more rib techniques just to create some texture down inside here. And I might take the end of this rib and sort of work up and down to create a wave pattern in here. And then from the inside, I like to push this out and give it a little bit of volume. And it should keep my wave pattern in there somewhat. Okay, if I don't like that, it's not that difficult to go in with the rib and smooth it out. I wasn't thrilled with that one. Maybe try it again, or I could use a different tool. Maybe I'll try this little serrated rib. This might be a little harsh, but we'll try it. That works. Now one more time to clean up the rim. Clean up the edge here and the one at the bottom. Make sure I've got no water in the base. If you leave water in your base, you're likely to get a crack because it doesn't dry evenly. And do my undercut.